What happens when a nation's past is twisted into a neat little narrative of appeasement? Well, for starters, it creates a generation of people who are unsure whether their own heroes are really, well, heroes. It gives us students who come out of school so enlightened that they can name every single Mughal emperor but scratch their heads when you ask them who built the Chittorgarh fort. And the invaders? Oh, they are just misunderstood. Apparently, sacking temples and enslaving populations was just part of their charm. Meanwhile, the warrior kings of India? Reduced to footnotes in the grand sanitized tale of India's glorious diversity. How inclusive! This is not just a distortion. It is an erasure of the Kshatriya spirit, the ancient warrior ethos that once defined India. The spirit that made kings like Maharana Pratap and Shivaji Maharaj stand tall against mighty empires. We are here today to uncover a truth that has been buried for too long. A truth about India's past and why, even after 75 years of independence, we still struggle to find our true identity and reach our full potential. Let's start by talking about how our history was manipulated. Open any Indian history book and you will find pages upon pages dedicated to invaders like Akbar and Alauddin Khilji, while kings like Maharana Sanga and Krishnadeva barely get a mention. Their acts of valor that defiance in the face of overwhelming odds are overshadowed by a narrative that glorifies those who destroyed our temples, enslaved our people and looted our land. Why did this happen? The distortion of Indian history started way back in the colonial period of the British Empire. The British Empire, in its rabid quest to dominate India, didn't just plunder our wealth. They systematically dismantled our cultural, educational and spiritual foundations. The most infamous architect of this distortion was Thomas Babington Macaulay, the man who brought the British education system to India. In 1835, Macaulay declared in his speech to the British Parliament that a single shelf of a good European library was worth more than the entire literature of India and Arabia. Oh really? I'm sure that the Vedas and the Upanishads would make great footrests for his sophisticated books. Fueled by arrogance and an agenda of dominance, this mindset led to the destruction of around 700,000 gurukuls, schools that existed in every village of India, where Vedic knowledge and indigenous wisdom had been passed on for generations. These gurukuls weren't just institutions of learning, they were the lifeblood of India's intellectual and spiritual heritage. With their destruction, a vast reservoir of India's intellectual and spiritual wealth was severed at its roots. In their place, the British established a system designed not to empower us, but to create a class of Indians who were British in taste, opinion and intellect, but still subservient to the empire. Or as Macaulay might say, a convenient class of brown Englishmen. His sinister intentions behind introducing English education are very clear from what he says next. I have travelled across the length and breadth of India and have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Yes, Macaulay probably never had the time to notice the actual culture. He was too busy planning its demise. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral value, people of such caliber that I do not think that we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. Translation, let's make them forget who they are and then they'll be ripe for the picking. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture, for if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem and their native self-culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. What a strategy! Nothing like psychological warfare to strip an entire civilization of its pride. And the price we paid was terrible and devastating. Millions of Indian children were severed from the Vedic sciences, the deep philosophical, mathematical, and scientific foundations our ancestors had built. India's intellectual wealth, whether it was in medicine, astronomy, or philosophy, was not only suppressed but stolen. And what could not be stolen, the British claimed as their own. We often speak of Newton as the father of modern physics. But how often do we hear about Brahmagupta, the ancient Indian mathematician and astronomer who had long before described gravitational forces in his works? The same can be said for numerous other Indian contributions to science and mathematics that were conveniently erased or attributed to European scholars. But the real tragedy is how effective this destruction was. As Macaulay predicted, within a century, India's history became what the British wrote. They minimized the atrocities of the Mughal and the British rule, sanitized the exploitation of India, and wrote a version of history that glorified the so-called civilizing mission of the British while portraying us as a people in need of salvation. How charitable of them to save us from our own glorious past. What they did was far more than theft. They stripped us of our identity and rewrote our story. The loss was not just financial or material, it was cultural and relational. Our languages, our traditions, and our sense of self were dismantled. Now let's come to the post-independence period. Now one would expect that a country that fought hard to gain independence would restore its national narrative and do away with colonial vestiges after independence, correct? Not in India's case. Post-independence, our leaders championed an ideology so toothless, even a baby could bite through it. Take our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance. He was a man with a vision to turn India into a secular socialist paradise. Sounds nice, right? Except that this paradise involves suppressing India's very soul, its warrior spirit, and replacing it with, well, nothing much really. Nehru's socialist and secular agenda, while perhaps well-intentioned, did immeasurable damage to the national psyche. Instead of reviving the Kshatriya spirit, the warrior ethos that had been the backbone of Indian resistance to foreign invaders for centuries, Nehru systematically worked to suppress it. Ah yes, by reawakening the spirit of our warriors when we could promote defeatist pacifism instead. His policies promoted a hollow vision of non-violence and a distorted notion of secularism that further disconnected Indians from their identity. A telling example of this was Nehru's vehement opposition to the reopening of the Somnath temple, a temple desecrated by invaders, a symbol of our long struggle against the forces that sought to erase our culture. In Nehru's mind, reopening the Somnath would have hurt the sentiments of the Muslim community. Because clearly, centuries of desecration and pillaging of Hindu temples wasn't hurtful at all. But hey, let's not upset anyone else. But what about the Hindu sentiment, the wounds inflicted on our civilization for centuries? Nehru's fear of alienating certain groups made him blind to the necessity of reclaiming our cultural pride. In fact, in 1959 he said, "Hindu temples are oppressive and they don't allow me to rise. I feel oppressed. If you want to see the beauty of a good building, then the Taj Mahal is a template." Of course, he found the Taj Mahal more impressive. It wasn't oppressive because it was an Indo-Islamic monument, right? This deep-seated bias against Hindu heritage and history showed that Nehru was more concerned with political appeasement than with healing the deep wounds of our nation. And what about his insult to one of our greatest heroes? Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, the symbol of Hindu resistance against Mughal tyranny, was referred to in Nehru's glimpses of world history in a shockingly condescending manner. Shivaji, who stood tall against Aurangzeb's ruthless expansion, was dismissed as a mere treacherous local king by Nehru. Oh yes, because defending your people from bloodthirsty invaders is clearly treachery. This wasn't just an insult to Shivaji, it was an insult to the entire Indic spirit of resistance. This narrative of downplaying Hindu achievements, particularly from the pre-Islamic era, was not an accident. It was institutionalized through the NCERT, where left-leaning historians like Romila Thapar and Irfan Habib cemented a version of history that marginalized the greatness of ancient India. They consistently whitewashed the crimes committed against the Hindus and brainwashed young Indians to see the Mughals as benevolent rulers. For decades, students in India were learning history through a lens that deliberately erased our true heritage. This historical sanitization went so far that Robila Thapar even dismissed temple destruction as exaggerations. Ah yes, because apparently hundreds of temples were accidentally turned into mosques, just like how minor fender benders occur in parking lots. And of course, the sex slavery of Hindu women under Mughal rule? That was just an overblown rumor, right? Clearly, history was just having an off day when it recorded those events. But here is the real kicker. Instead of correcting these distortions after independence, we just doubled down on them. Irfan Habib and his comrades made sure to keep the narrative neat, sweet, and colonially approved. Who needs to know about the actual Kshatriya spirit when you can read page after page of Mughal glories, right? But what was the effect of this pacifist narrative on the Indian psyche? To understand this, let's take the example of another country in Asia, Japan. Ravaged by war and 2 nuclear bombs reduced to ashes, Japan didn't waste time debating which invader to appease or which parts of their own identity to erase for greater harmony. No, they rebuilt from scratch, driven by an unyielding national spirit, embodied in the Bushido Code, the samurai's code of honor, loyalty, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. Masahiko Kimura didn't abandon his judo training after the war or wait around for foreign approval or validation of his skills. He mastered the art while staying deeply rooted in his own culture. Japan understood one thing: to rise, you must have pride in who you are. They knew that Western ideas could be borrowed, but not at the expense of losing their core identity. They revived their warrior spirit, reorganized themselves as one nation, and used that united front to build one of the world's most powerful economies. The Kshatriya spirit could have galvanized India into a united front, a community bound by a shared history and values, standing tall and proud. But instead, we decided to divide ourselves, region by region, caste by caste, belief by belief, appeasing everyone and standing for nothing. Imagine if Japan had bowed down to every Western influence and told themselves, you know what, let's dilute our samurai culture to make others feel more comfortable. After all, the last thing we want to do is offend anyone. They would still be a post-war colony, lost in the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we did that in India, didn't we? We turned away from our warrior roots and chose to be apologetic about our own identity. Instead of embracing our strength, we got bogged down in this notion that celebrating our own culture is somehow wrong. In the end, we have paid the price for abandoning our Kshatriya roots. We have traded the courage of a united warrior nation for the fragility of political correctness and appeasement. But it is not too late. If there's one lesson we can take from Japan, it's this: reclaim your roots, your strength, and your pride, and rise as one. Because without the Kshatriya spirit, India will remain a nation that apologizes for its past instead of standing tall in its future. As we come to the end of this video through the buried truths of our history, remember, this is just the beginning of something much larger, a movement to revive India's true spirit. Like the mighty Ganga, which flows from the Himalayas and brings life to our land, we too can channel the power of our heritage, nourish and strengthen our future. But remember, the Ganga is not one single stream. It is made up of millions of drops, each one contributing to its unstoppable force. When you subscribe to this channel, you are not just pressing a button, you are becoming a drop in this mighty river. Together we will create a flood of awareness, reclaiming our identity, one story, one truth at a time. The Kshatriya spirit that once defined India is not lost. It lives within each of us. And just like the Ganga, we will carve a path through every obstacle, bringing our nation back to its rightful glory. So join us. Become a part of this movement. Let's make history, not as it was written by others, but as we, the descendants of a proud and ancient civilization, will now write it. Subscribe, share, and stand tall because together we are the mighty Ganga, unstoppable and eternal.